Hi, everyone, and thanks, Paul, for that. I think my NATO colleagues in my former job in the Pentagon would be happy that you said the words NID and NED in a conference, that people actually are aware of the NATO planning process. So today I've also been asked to address whether NATO is able to make decisions quickly enough, and I would also say it's a bit of a mixed picture. We've already heard about some of the measures that were taken at the July summit and even before then since 2014 to help NATO act at the speed of relevance. And what's clear in all of these is that credible deterrence depends on rapid response, decision-making, logistics, ready forces, and agile command structure. And speed is even more important in today's security environment. Unlike in the Cold War, we had significant forces positioned forward. Now we're relying on what we call a rapid reinforcement model. So we have about 4,500 NATO forces through the enhanced forward presence in Poland and the Baltic states, others in the Black Sea region through the tailored forward presence, plus some US forces stationed in Europe through bilateral initiatives. However, those forces need to be able to move quickly once a decision is taken, and that's where things get a bit difficult. When I was working in the Pentagon, Secretary Mattis had 4 priorities. Readiness, the 430s were mentioned by Shell, the military mobility and the command structure, and speed of decision making. We achieved all of those except for speed of decision making, despite a very big US effort to push changes to the crisis decision making process that was shown earlier. And what it really came down to was capitals. So everybody was aware of the NATO decision making process, but where we kind of left off with the idea that it's not just what you just saw, 1/3 of NATO allies about more or less require approval from their parliaments. Other countries such as Germany require a month's warning to work through things like forces even being able to transit through their territory. So you can see that even if NATO in and of itself is able to make a decision rather quickly, a lot of countries need to go back to capitals, and that's where you can get into some difficulties. What the US was pushing in the run-up to the July summit was to impose timelines on the NATO process that you saw, so that when SACEUR said, I want to activate graduated response plans, there would be not an infinite amount of time for capitals to debate the merits of that. And why is this so difficult? I've sort of thought a little bit about it, and I kind of came to 2 conclusions. One is you're really challenging leaders to balance the need for rapid response with national sovereignty and political control. And they don't like being forced to move quickly and pressured to work through these processes on under time pressure. Secondly, you're asking these leaders to make decisions and act on less than perfect information. In economics, they call this information asymmetry. With conventional as well as non-military methods of force now being used, this is even more complicated. There's deliberate disinformation being used to complicate the decision-making picture and undermine the national decision-making processes. So leaders are not yet comfortable on making decisions with that imperfect information. So where does all that leave us? Is NATO set to respond quickly in a crisis? So I would say also, on balance, there is a crisis decision-making in place, and we are aware of some of the shortcomings with regard to timelines and the roles of national capitals, and individual allies are trying to work on that. I also think we have a good track record. It was already mentioned how quickly NATO was able to act in essentially less than 24 hours in the case of 9/11. Now, of course, that was collective defense and, an incursion on the territory of a member state from outside the alliance. So that was a little bit more straightforward than a hybrid scenario. But I'd also point to a situation like Kosovo, where it hasn't been mentioned yet that in this decision-making process, NATO also works by consensus as opposed to unanimity. And I think that's an important point. So when nations sit around the big table that Paul showed, they don't have to say yes or no, vote yay or nay. Essentially, they can find a way to politically endorse or maintain silence so they don't block a decision. So in essence, this enables a coalition of the willing, whereby countries can give a political yes, but they don't have to participate, as was the case with Greece in Kosovo. And this is a model I'll come back to, because I think this is how we may be approaching some of the scenarios that NATO will face in the coming years. I'm going to go through a couple of suggestions that I think would help make our national leaders a little bit more comfortable in terms of responding quickly to decisions. The first was already mentioned, that SACEUR has the authority to kind of buy time by staging and alerting some elements of the NATO response force, particularly the High Readiness Task Force Spearhead Force we call the VJTF. However, ideally, he would also have the ability to deploy some of those elements before the NAC decision. I think, a lot of people get nervous about this suggestion, but essentially, through all the planning efforts that I've been involved in, phase 0, before the actual conflict and the incursion starts, when you have strong indications and warnings, that's the time to act to stop things from moving to phase 2. So by deploying these smaller elements of the NRF, you can deter, demonstrate resolve, and you can validate. You would have more eyes on the ground that can tell you what's really going on in that situation. So I think that delegating more authority to SACEUR, maybe in a time-limited way, or make that a joint authority with the Secretary General if you're concerned about political control, would be a way to make leaders a little bit more comfortable with rapid decision-making and political control. Secondly, I think it was mentioned as well, indications and warnings, operating with less than perfect intelligence. Some of the improvements that have been made, and I point to Norway as a great example of this, are on situational awareness, maritime domain awareness, investments in things like P8s, and other forms of intelligence are invaluable because it's the people who are closest to the situation, who know what normal looks like and what abnormal looks like, who are going to be able to validate those specific threats in a region. Thirdly, we need to better prepare our national decision makers, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room can probably help with that. Parliamentarians and other select committees within the cabinets need to understand that they will be called on to make important decisions in a timely fashion in a crisis scenario. So if you run crisis management exercises or military exercises where decision-making is integrated, you could bring over a NATO representative who could play that role and almost have a kind of policy game. NATO's done this at the ministerial level a couple of times and regularly does crisis management exercises to test decision-making. But we need to bring that process to national decision makers and inject that realism so they know what expectations are of them. Finally, I'd say they need to better align national and NATO scenarios. And this is coming back to that scenario in which we do not have an NAC decision that is unanimous, where it looks like we may get that political chapeau that we had in Kosovo, but in reality it'll be a coalition of willing forces, most likely regional allies, where there is that spillover effect, who will be acting. And in that case, we need to have done up front the alignment of the national plans and the NATO plans and thought through things like the enablers, the command structure, et cetera. And finally, because I've been asked to kind of represent a US position, I'll talk a little bit about US process and considerations. Within the US system, unlike some of the European allies, we do have that flexibility built in, whereby Congress allows some quick action without authorization, like the deployment of the 173rd, and then we need to report back within 48 hours as to whether the situation has become worse or better. So we do have some flexibility that looks a lot like those crisis response measures that SACEUR has been given. In addition to the NATO standing plans, I can't say a lot about it, but the US does have on-the-shelf plans for the defense of US forces in Europe, using EUCOM forces, pre-positioned forces under EDI, and other resources. But I'll be honest, there's a reluctance to reveal that because NATO planning should be in the lead. There should not be this reliance on individual nations to carry the entire scenario or to be the first to act. There are expectations of allies in terms of resilience, so the ability to kind of hold their own within those initial hours, to be able to receive host nation support, which is exactly what Trident Juncture was getting at, and then an expectation of an eventual handoff to NATO. So even within our plans, it's that initial phase whereby the US may have to act alone or with other like-minded allies, but there's always an off-ramp to handing that over to NATO if and when an NAC decision is taken. Finally, I'll say congratulations to Norway for progress it's made in all of these, on resilience, on increasing awareness in the High North through things like the acquisition of P8s and working together with the UK and US on maritime domain awareness, and just generally increasing the profile and focus on the North Atlantic. within NATO. When I look back at some of the work plans we had 4 years ago, I think we've checked all the boxes in terms of getting NATO more involved in the North Atlantic. So in sum, lots more to be done, but it's getting better, and we're on the problem.